August 17, 1943. 1,015 hours. Rastenburg railway platform, East Prussia. 31-year-old General der Jagdflieger Adolf Joseph Ferdinand Galland stood on a wooden platform at Rastenburg station, watching Reichsmarschall Hermann Wilhelm Göring board his personal luxury train. The train, a converted passenger, consists with mahogany paneling, silk curtains, and a dining car that seated 20, represented everything about the Luftwaffe's senior leadership that frustrated Galland. Göring traveled in opulence while fighter pilots died in burning cockpits over Germany. Göring held meetings in palaces while squadrons were ground down through attrition. Göring made pronouncements about air superiority while American bombers struck German cities with increasing impunity. But Galland had not come to the railway platform to contemplate leadership failures. He had come to deliver intelligence that could not wait. Intelligence so critical that it needed to reach Göring before the Reichsmarschall's train departed for Berlin. Intelligence about American fighter aircraft appearing deep inside German airspace, far beyond where any escort fighter should have been able to reach. Galland carried a leather folder containing reports from squadron commanders across the Reich. The reports all described the same phenomenon: American escort fighters engaging Luftwaffe interceptors over targets in central Germany, over Schweinfurt, over Regensburg, over locations that were supposed to be beyond the range of any American fighter base in England. The escorts were identified as Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, twin-engine, twin-boom fighters that German pilots called der Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devil. But these P-38s were different from previous encounters. They were equipped with external drop tanks, large cylindrical fuel containers attached beneath the wings that dramatically extended their operational range. The drop tanks changed everything. American bomber formations no longer had to penetrate German airspace unescorted. The fiction that Luftwaffe fighters could wait at the border for American escorts to turn back, that comfortable assumption upon which German defensive doctrine was based, had been shattered. American fighters could now escort bombers throughout their entire mission profile. They could engage German interceptors over the target. They could pursue retreating German fighters back toward their bases. The tactical situation had fundamentally changed, and German defensive doctrine needed to change with it immediately. Galland approached Göring as the Reichsmarschall supervised the loading of his personal luggage. Göring was 50 years old in August 1943, massively overweight, addicted to morphine, and increasingly detached from the operational reality of the air war. He had been a combat pilot in World War I, earning the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military decoration, after achieving 22 victories. But that had been 25 years earlier. The Göring of 1943 bore little resemblance to the lean fighter ace of 1918. He spent more time collecting art and designing elaborate uniforms than visiting frontline squadrons. His understanding of modern air combat was based on assumptions that had not been updated since 1940. Galland saluted. Göring acknowledged him with a wave. Galland opened a leather folder and began his briefing. He spoke clearly and directly, as he always did. The intelligence concerned American P-38 Lightning fighters appearing over targets deep inside Germany. Squadron commanders reported engagements over Schweinfurt, over Regensburg, over locations 300 kilometers from the French coast. The P-38s were equipped with drop tanks that extended their range dramatically. The implications were profound. German doctrine assumed that American escort fighters would turn back at predictable points due to fuel limitations. That assumption was no longer valid. American fighters could now escort bombers throughout German airspace. Defensive tactics needed immediate revision. Göring listened to Galland's briefing with an expression that Galland had seen before. It was the expression Göring wore when receiving information that contradicted his preferred version of reality. The Reichsmarschall's face reddened. His voice rose. He declared that American fighters had not reached that far into Germany. The reports were mistaken. The fighters Galland's squadron commanders described must have been damaged aircraft that had glided eastward after being hit over France or Belgium. They were anomalies, flukes, not evidence of extended range capability. Galland protested. He explained the drop tank system in detail. External fuel tanks could be jettisoned when empty, allowing fighters to extend their range without compromising combat performance. Multiple squadrons had reported identical encounters on the same day. These were not damaged aircraft gliding. These were fighters at full combat capability, engaging German interceptors deep inside the Reich. The intelligence was verified by squadron commanders with years of combat experience. The threat was real and immediate. Göring cut him off mid-sentence. The Reichsmarschall stated that it was physically impossible for American fighters to reach central Germany from bases in England. The distance was too great. The fuel consumption was too high. American fighters lacked range. What Galland was describing violated the fundamental parameters of fighter aircraft performance. Therefore, it had not happened. The reports were wrong. Galland tried again. He cited specific engagements with exact times and locations. He referenced pilot testimony from multiple squadrons. He offered to provide detailed technical analysis of drop tank systems and their impact on operational range. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Göring gave Galland a direct order. He officially asserted that American long-range fighters had not crossed into central Germany. This was not a suggestion or a hypothesis. This was an order. Galland was to cease making such reports. Squadron commanders were to be informed that their observations were mistaken. The Luftwaffe would continue operations based on existing doctrine. Nothing would change. Galland understood immediately what was happening. Göring was not disputing the intelligence because he had contradictory evidence. Göring was denying reality because accepting it would require admitting that German defensive doctrine was obsolete, that the strategic situation had changed fundamentally, that the Luftwaffe faced a threat it was unprepared to counter. Admitting those facts would require Göring to acknowledge failure. His failure as commander of the Luftwaffe. And Göring would not do that. Galland replied with what witnesses later described as an unforgettable smile. Zu Befehl, Herr Reichsmarschall. Orders are orders. The train departed. Galland watched it leave. He knew with absolute certainty that the Luftwaffe had just lost its opportunity to prepare for a threat that would destroy it. What happened next would doom thousands of German pilots who would die fighting an enemy they had been officially told did not exist. The intelligence Galland had tried to present was based on combat reports from August 17th, 1943, the same day as the railway platform confrontation. On that day, the United States Army Air Forces had launched Operation Juggler, a massive coordinated strike against two critical German industrial targets. Over 600 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers attacked simultaneously. The 4th bombardment wing struck the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, deep in southern Germany. The 1st bombardment wing struck ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt in central Germany. Both targets were beyond the range of standard American escort fighters. Both were supposed to be safe from escorted daylight bombing. But the Americans had brought their P-38 Lightnings. The twin-engine fighters, equipped with 150-gallon drop tanks under each wing, had escorted the bombers far deeper into Germany than German intelligence believed possible. Over Schweinfurt, P-38s of the 55th Fighter Group engaged Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s at the moment German fighters were positioning to attack the bombers. Over Regensburg, P-38s of the 20th Fighter Group fought German interceptors over the target itself, 310 kilometers inside German territory. The mission was brutal for both sides. The Americans lost 60 bombers, 10% of the attacking force, 600 airmen killed or captured. German fighter losses were approximately 27 aircraft destroyed with pilots killed or wounded. But the tactical situation had changed permanently. For the first time, the Luftwaffe had faced American bomber formations escorted throughout their entire penetration into German airspace. The old doctrine, wait at the border, let the escorts turn back, then attack unprotected bombers, was obsolete. Major Egon Mayer, Commander 3, Jagdflieger 2, had led the interception against the Schweinfurt formation. Mayer was 28 years old, a veteran fighter pilot with 57 confirmed victories. He had pioneered the head-on attack against American heavy bombers, recognizing that frontal attacks minimize exposure to the devastating defensive firepower of B-17 gun turrets. On August 17th, Mayer's squadron executed textbook head-on attacks against the bomber stream. They scored hits on multiple aircraft. Then P-38 escorts dove from altitude. The escorts had been positioned above and behind the bombers, waiting for exactly this moment. They had fuel remaining because of the drop tanks. They had altitude advantage because they had not been engaged during the approach to target. They fell on Mayer's scattered formation like wolves on sheep. 3 German fighters were destroyed in the first pass. Mayer himself barely escaped when a P-38 locked onto his tail. He pushed his Messerschmitt Bf-109 into a maximum performance dive and outran the heavier American fighter at low altitude. But 5 of his pilots did not return. 3 killed, 2 captured after bailing out. 0 bombers confirmed destroyed. The loss ratio was unacceptable. Before the arrival of long-range escorts, German fighter units typically destroyed 3 or 4 bombers for every fighter lost. On August 17, 1943, that ratio had collapsed. The Luftwaffe shot down 60 bombers, but lost 27 fighters in the process. And the trend would only get worse. Galland compiled all the intelligence from August 17th into a comprehensive report. He documented P-38 sightings over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and other deep penetration targets. He included pilot testimony, engagement times, and altitude data. He analyzed the tactical implications. American bombers could now strike any target in Germany with continuous fighter escort. German defensive doctrine was obsolete. New tactics were needed immediately. Fighter production needed to increase. Pilot training needed to expand. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, still in development, should be rushed into service despite technical problems. Its speed advantage would allow it to penetrate escort screens and attack bombers without being intercepted by piston-engine fighters. Galland sent the report to Göring, to the Air Ministry, to Luftwaffe operational headquarters. He received no response. Göring had given his order in August. American long-range fighters were not a strategic threat. The Luftwaffe would continue current operations. Nothing would change. But everything was about to change. Between August and December 1943, American fighter capabilities expanded far beyond what Galland had warned about. The P-38 Lightning with drop tanks was just the beginning. On December 1st, 1943, something new appeared over Germany that would make the P-38 threat seem manageable by comparison. December 1st, 1943. 1,340 hours. 30,000 feet above the English Channel. 24-year-old Captain Donald Gentile of the 336 Fighter Squadron, 4th Fighter Group, pushed the throttle forward on his P-51 Mustang and felt the aircraft accelerate with an eagerness that still surprised him after 2 weeks of flying the new fighter. The Mustang responded to control inputs with precision that bordered on telepathy. It climbed like it weighed half its actual mass. It dove without the control stiffening that plagued the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt at high speeds. And most importantly, it had range. With 275-gallon drop tanks, the P-51 could fly over 800 miles from base, spend time in combat, and return home with fuel remaining. Gentile had flown P-47 Thunderbolts for 6 months before transitioning to the Mustang. The P-47 was a capable fighter, tough, powerful, deadly in a dive. But it was also heavy, sluggish in turns, and limited in range. Even with drop tanks, the P-47 could barely escort bombers to the German border before fuel constraints forced it to turn back. The P-51 changed everything. Berlin was 600 miles from England. Every industrial target in Germany was now within reach of escorted daylight bombing. The 4th Fighter Group was flying its first operational mission in the P-51B. The unit had received its aircraft only 2 weeks earlier. Most pilots had fewer than 10 hours in type, but the Mustang was intuitive to fly and forgiving of pilot error. It handled like a fighter half its weight. American pilots who had flown other types universally praised the Mustang's flying qualities. It was fast, maneuverable, responsive, and blessed with range that no other single-engine fighter could match. On December 1st, the mission was modest, a fighter sweep over northern France to familiarize pilots with the aircraft performance and to demonstrate American air superiority over occupied territory. The 4th Fighter Group encountered no enemy aircraft. The mission was uneventful, but it represented the beginning of something that would doom the Luftwaffe. Over the next 2 weeks, P-51 Mustangs gradually extended their operational radius. On December 5th, they escorted bombers to Amiens in northern France. On December 11th, they reached Emden on the German coast. On December 13, 1943, they achieved a breakthrough that changed the air war permanently. 55 P-51 Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group escorted B-17 bombers to Kiel, 480 miles from England, 240 miles inside Germany. The mission lasted 4 hours and 30 minutes. The Mustangs engaged Luftwaffe interceptors over the target area and shot down 6 German fighters without loss. American bombers struck U-boat construction facilities with minimal interference. The mission proved that American heavy bombers could now reach any target in Germany with fighter protection throughout the entire mission profile. Adolf Galland received intelligence reports about the new American fighter within days. His sources provided detailed information. The aircraft was designated P-51B, manufactured by North American Aviation. It was powered by a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license by Packard Motors in the United States. The Merlin had a 2-stage supercharger that maintained power at altitudes above 30,000 feet. Combined with the Mustang's efficient aerodynamics, the Merlin engine created a fighter with unprecedented performance at high altitude. Galland studied the technical specifications with growing concern. Maximum speed, 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, faster than the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190 at that altitude. Service ceiling, 42,000 feet, higher than any German piston-engine fighter in operational service. Combat radius with drop tanks, 800 miles, twice the range of any previous escort fighter. Armament, 4.50 caliber machine guns or 6.50 caliber machine guns depending on variant. Sufficient firepower to destroy any German fighter with a well-aimed burst. The P-51 Mustang was not just another American fighter. It was a revolutionary aircraft that solved the fundamental problem that had plagued the American strategic bombing campaign since 1942, how to protect bombers during deep penetration raids into Germany. The British had tried daylight bombing in 1940 and suffered catastrophic losses to German fighters. The Americans had insisted that heavily armed B-17 and B-24 bombers could defend themselves through mass defensive fire. Experience had proven otherwise. Without fighter escort, bomber losses to German interceptors were unsustainable. With the P-51, American bombers could now strike any target in Germany with continuous fighter protection. Galland flew to Berlin in late December 1943 to brief Göring on the P-51 threat. He brought technical specifications, performance data, combat reports from pilots who had engaged a new fighter. He presented the intelligence methodically. The P-51 was faster than German fighters at all altitudes above 20,000 feet. It could turn with German fighters in sustained maneuvering combat. It had range to escort bombers to any target in Germany. With external drop tanks, it could fly the entire round-trip distance from England to Berlin and still have fuel for 30 minutes of combat. Galland recommended emergency measures. All available resources should be redirected to fighter production. The Me-262 jet program should receive absolute top priority. Training should be accelerated despite fuel shortages. Germany needed to adapt immediately or face strategic defeat in the air war over the Reich. Göring dismissed the concerns. He stated that the P-51 was just another American fighter. German pilots were superior through training and experience. German tactics were superior through years of combat refinement. The Luftwaffe would prevail through skill and courage. Galland had been making alarmist predictions for months. None of them had proven accurate. The Luftwaffe was still strong. German defenses were still effective. The Americans would eventually exhaust their resources and accept negotiated peace. Galland argued. He showed Göring intelligence reports. He explained what would happen when P-51s escorted bombers to Berlin. Göring refused to listen. The meeting ended with nothing resolved. Galland returned to his headquarters knowing the Luftwaffe had sealed its own fate through willful blindness. The American strategic bombing campaign intensified through January and February 1944. P-51 Mustangs appeared in growing numbers. They escorted bombers to Frankfurt, to Leipzig, to targets throughout central Germany that had previously been beyond escort range. Luftwaffe losses climbed steadily. German pilots who had survived years of combat were being shot down by American fighters that could outperform, outmaneuver, and outlast anything Germany could put in the air. Then on February 20th, 1944, the Americans launched Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. 6 days of concentrated attacks on German aircraft factories. Over 3,500 American bombers struck targets across Germany, all escorted by swarms of P-38, P-47, and P-51 fighters. The Luftwaffe committed everything to stopping the raids. Every available fighter squadron threw itself into battle. Experienced aces flew multiple sorties per day. New pilots with minimal training were rushed into combat. The casualties were catastrophic. During Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters destroyed and another 180 damaged beyond immediate repair. But pilot losses were even worse. Approximately 100 pilots killed, 90 wounded, 43 missing. Among the dead were squadron commanders, flight leaders, experienced combat veterans who could not be replaced. Major Egon, who had survived the August 17th disaster and continued fighting through 5 more months, was killed on March 2nd, 1944. He was shot down by P-47 Thunderbolt escorts over France. He had 102 confirmed victories. He was 29 years old. His death represented the loss of irreplaceable tactical knowledge. Mayer had pioneered head-on attacks against American bombers. He had trained dozens of pilots in those techniques. His experience was gone, and there was no equivalent expertise to replace him. Hauptmann Kurt Ubben of Jagdflieger 3 was killed on February 22nd during a bomber interception over Brunswick. He had 110 victories. He was 24 years old. Ubben had been one of the most aggressive and successful bomber destroyers in the Luftwaffe. His loss further depleted the already thin ranks of experienced fighter leaders. These were not novice pilots. These were the core of Germany's fighter expertise, the men who trained new pilots, the leaders who organized effective tactics, the aces who could engage multiple enemies and survive. They were dying at rates that made replacement impossible. A fighter pilot needed 6 months of training to be minimally competent, a year to be good, 2 years to be excellent. Germany was losing pilots with 2, 3, 4 years of combat experience. They were being replaced by pilots who had 3 months of training and less than 200 total flight hours. Adolf Galland watched the casualty lists with growing despair. He compiled reports. He sent weekly summaries to Göring and the High Command. He described the tactical situation in detail. American fighters with extended range were escorting bombers throughout German airspace. The old doctrine was obsolete. New tactics were needed immediately. Fighter production needed to increase. Pilot training needed to expand. The Me-262 jet fighter should be rushed into service despite development problems. Galland received no response from Göring. The Reichsmarschall had made his decision in August 1943. American long-range fighters were not a strategic threat. The Luftwaffe would continue current operations. Nothing would change. On March 4, 1944, the strategic situation reached a point of no return. American bombers struck Berlin for the first time with full fighter escort. Over 600 heavy bombers attacked the German capital. Escorting them were 174 P-51 Mustangs that flew the entire 1,100-mile round trip. The Mustangs fought German defenders over the heart of the Third Reich. They shot down 16 Luftwaffe fighters and lost only 4 aircraft. Berlin, the city that Hermann Göring had promised would never be bombed, was now within range of American daylight bombing with complete fighter protection. Göring reportedly said privately that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. But he said it privately. Publicly, he continued insisting everything was under control. The Luftwaffe was still strong. German pilots were still superior. The Americans would eventually exhaust their resources. The reality was catastrophically different. By April 1944, Galland faced a crisis so severe that he filed a report directly with the High Command, bypassing Göring entirely. The report was dated April 27, 1944. It outlined the state of the Luftwaffe fighter force with brutal honesty. In the previous 4 months, January through April 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 1,000 pilots killed, wounded, or captured. The enemy outnumbered German fighters 6-1 in some operations, 8-1 in others. Allied pilot training standards were extraordinarily high. Most American and British pilots entering combat had 400 to 500 hours of flight time. German pilots were being sent into battle with less than 200 hours. Some had less than 150 hours total flight time. The training infrastructure had collapsed due to fuel shortages and constant Allied attacks on training airfields. New pilots arrived at frontline squadrons with insufficient skills to survive even their first few missions. They could not maintain formation. They panicked under fire. They made fundamental errors that got themselves and their wingmen killed. Squadron commanders reported that sending these undertrained pilots into combat against seasoned Allied fighter pilots was tantamount to murder. Galland stated in his report that he would rather have one Me-262 jet fighter in action than 5 Bf-109s. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied fighter by 100 miles per hour. It could break through escort screens and attack bombers without being intercepted. But Hitler had insisted it be developed as a bomber, not a fighter. Precious months had been wasted converting the aircraft to carry bombs instead of maximizing its potential as an interceptor. The report was ignored. Göring refused to acknowledge the crisis. The Air Ministry issued directives calling for improved morale and more aggressive tactics. Nobody addressed a fundamental problem. German pilots were outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outmatched by better-trained Allied opponents flying superior long-range fighters. Between January and May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 2,262 fighter pilots killed, wounded, or missing. Not aircraft, pilots. The irreplaceable human component. March 1944 alone saw catastrophic attrition. Entire squadrons were decimated. Jagdflieger 11 lost 28 pilots in 3 weeks. Jagdflieger 3 lost 31 pilots. These were elite units with years of combat experience being shattered against overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. The mathematics of destruction were simple and absolute. Germany could lose 10 fighters and struggle to replace them within a month. The Americans could lose 100 fighters and replace them within days. The British could lose 50 bombers and have them replaced within a week. The industrial capacity was not equal. The pilot training pipeline was not equal. The strategic situation was not equal. Germany was losing a war of attrition. It could never win. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Luftwaffe 3, responsible for defending France, had 481 aircraft available on June 5th. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe managed to fly 319 sorties. The Allies flew 14,674 sorties. The disparity was so complete that many Allied soldiers did not see a single German aircraft during the first week of the invasion. Oberstleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, commander of Jagdflieger 26, was one of Germany's most successful fighter leaders with 101 victories. On D-Day morning, Priller and his wingman, Feldwebel Heinz Wudersick, were the only German pilots to attack the invasion beaches directly, flying 2 Focke-Wulf FW-190s from Lille at extremely low altitude. They strafed Sword Beach, then escaped back to base. Their 2 aircraft constituted the entire German fighter response to the largest amphibious invasion in history. Priller later stated the mission was suicidal, but necessary to demonstrate that the Luftwaffe had not completely abandoned the German army. He survived the war and lived until 1961. But his 2 aircraft attack on June 6, 1944, symbolized everything that had gone wrong with the Luftwaffe. A force that had dominated European skies in 1940 had been reduced to token gestures by 1944. The weeks after D-Day saw desperate and futile air combat. Luftwaffe units threw themselves against overwhelming Allied air power in a doomed attempt to support German ground forces. Losses were staggering. By the end of June 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 300 fighters in the West. July losses exceeded 400. August losses approached 500. German factories were actually producing more aircraft than ever, over 1,500 fighters per month by mid-1944. But the aircraft could not be effectively used. There was insufficient fuel to train pilots properly. There were not enough experienced pilots to fly the new aircraft. Maintenance facilities were being bombed. Even when aircraft could be made operational, they rarely survived more than a handful of missions. By July 1944, Galland was receiving casualty reports showing 50 fighter pilots killed or missing every single day. Every day, 50 pilots. Luftwaffe training schools graduated approximately 30 pilots per week. The mathematics were simple. Losses exceeded replacement capacity by a factor 10. There was no way to sustain operations. The fighter force was dying. Squadron commanders reported that new pilots arriving from training were effectively helpless in combat. They lacked basic survival skills. One experienced squadron leader compared receiving new pilots in mid-1944 to executing them. Sending undertrained pilots into combat against seasoned American and British fighter pilots was murder, but there was no choice. Germany had no reserve of trained pilots. Everyone who completed training went immediately to the front and died within weeks. On November 2, 1944, Galland launched his last major defensive operation. He sent 500 fighters against 975 American bombers attacking synthetic oil plants. The bombers were escorted by 800 fighters, 600 of them P-51 Mustangs. The Americans shot down 98 German fighters, killing 78 pilots. The Americans lost only 50 aircraft total, 30 of them to anti-aircraft fire, not fighters. Germany could no longer afford such losses. Hitler and Göring were furious. The Ardennes offensive was being planned for December. Hitler ordered Galland to prepare fighter reserves to support the ground attack rather than defend the Reich. Elite fighter wings that had fought for years would now be moved to support a ground offensive that had no chance of strategic success. On January 13, 1945, Galland was relieved of command as General der Jagdflieger. Göring blamed him for the Luftwaffe's failures, the constant complaints, the defeatist reports, the criticism of leadership. Galland was placed under house arrest. He faced possible court-martial, even execution for undermining morale and defeatism. Heinrich Himmler sought to put him on trial for treason, but Hitler intervened. The Führer respected Galland's reputation as a skilled combat pilot and successful fighter leader. More importantly, Hitler recognized that court-martialing Germany's most famous fighter ace would be a propaganda disaster. Hitler allowed Galland to return to active duty on one condition. Galland would form and command Jagdverband 44, an elite jet fighter unit equipped with Me-262 aircraft. Galland accepted immediately. He gathered 10 holders of the Knight's Cross, experienced aces who had survived years of combat. Among them, Oberst Johannes Steinhoff with 176 kills, Major Gerhard Barkhorn with 301 kills, Oberstleutnant Heinz Barr with 220 kills. These were some of the most successful fighter pilots in history, equipped with the most advanced fighter aircraft of the war. The Me-262 was everything Galland had claimed. Top speed, 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. Armament, for 30mm cannons with devastating firepower. Rate of climb, 30,000 feet in 7 minutes. The jet engines gave acceleration that piston engine fighters could not match. In combat, the Me-262 could choose when to engage and when to disengage. Allied fighters could not catch it in level flight or in a dive. Jagdverband 44 flew its first combat missions in late March 1945. Between March 31st and April 26, Galland's squadron destroyed 45 Allied bombers and fighters. But it made no difference to the outcome of the war. Germany was collapsing. Soviet forces were fighting in Berlin. British and American forces had crossed the Rhine. German cities were ruins. The fuel supply had ended. Even elite jet units were grounded for days due to lack of aviation gasoline. On April 26, 1945, Galland led 12 Me-262s from Munchen to intercept American bombers. At approximately 1,500 hours, while engaging bombers south of Munich, Galland's aircraft was hit by fire from AP-47 Thunderbolt. The pilot was First Lieutenant James Finnegan of the 56th Fighter Group. 50 caliber rounds tore through Galland's canopy and instrument panel. Both engines were hit. Metal splinters struck his right knee. The aircraft was severely damaged but still controllable. Galland broke off and dove away. He nursed the crippled Me-262 back toward Munchen at low altitude with both engines losing power. He crash-landed near the airfield. Medical examination showed 2 metal splinters embedded in his kneecap. The injury ended his flying career. 8 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. May 1945 through 1996. Legacy and truth. Adolf Joseph Ferdinand Galland survived the war. He was captured by Allied forces and spent time as a prisoner until 1947. After release, he worked as a military advisor to the Argentine Air Force for 6 years. He returned to Germany in 1955 and worked as an aerospace consultant. He published his autobiography, The First and the Last, in 1954. The book detailed his experiences as General der Jagdflieger and his conflicts with Göring and Hitler over air strategy. It became one of the most important primary sources on Luftwaffe operations. Galland lived until 1996. He died at age 83 in Remagen, Germany, on February 9, 1996. Throughout his life, historians asked him about the turning point of the air war. When did he know Germany would lose? Galland consistently pointed to August 17, 1943, the railway platform at Rastenburg. In a 1979 interview, Galland described the moment with clarity. I had presented Gore with evidence that American fighters could reach deep into Germany. I had shown him combat reports from multiple squadrons. I had explained the tactical implications. And he gave me an order that no such thing had happened. That was the moment I knew we had lost. Not because the Americans had better aircraft, though they did. Not because they had more pilots, though they did. We lost because our leadership refused to accept reality. They preferred comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. And thousands of my pilots died because of it. The numbers support Galland's assessment. In June 1943, before the railway platform confrontation, the Luftwaffe had lost 87 fighters. By August 1943, losses had climbed to 174. By October, 224. The trend was exponential and irreversible. More critically, the ratio of experienced pilots to novices was inverting. In June 1943, 60% of fighter pilots had more than 6 months combat experience. By October, only 40% did. The Luftwaffe was losing its most valuable asset, experienced pilots who could survive and train the next generation. Galland had warned in November 1943 that without immediate intervention, the fighter force would reach a critical breaking point within 6 months. After that point, losses would exceed the training pipeline's capacity to produce replacements. The fighter force would enter a death spiral from which recovery would be impossible. His prediction was accurate to the month. By May 1944, 6 months after his warning, the Luftwaffe had lost over 2,000 pilots and could not replace them. In 1979, 34 years after the war, Adolf Galland met James Finnegan at an Air Force Association meeting in San Francisco. A graduate student had matched Finnegan's combat report with German records and arranged a meeting. The two men talked for hours about the April 26 engagement. Finnegan described seeing the Mi-262 attacking bombers and positioning his P-47 for a deflection shot. Galland described feeling the impacts and struggling to keep the damaged jet flying. They discussed aircraft, tactics, the experience of combat. There was mutual respect between them. They had both been professional military pilots, doing their duty in a war neither had started. The meeting was filmed and became an important historical document, one of the rare occasions where a pilot and the man who shot him down met decades later to discuss the engagement in detail. After the war, military historians researching the Luftwaffe found extensive documentation of Galland's August 1943 confrontation with Göring. They found the railway platform exchange recorded in multiple sources, including memoirs by Albert Speer who witnessed part of the conversation. They found Galland's intelligence reports about long-range American fighters. They found Göring's dismissive responses and his order asserting that no such threat existed. They found subsequent combat reports proving that American fighters were penetrating deep into Germany exactly as Galland had warned. Military analysts concluded that Göring's refusal to accept Galland's intelligence in August 1943 was one of the most consequential command failures of the war. By denying reality, Göring ensured the Luftwaffe would be unprepared for the threat that ultimately destroyed it. If Germany had taken Galland's warning seriously, the outcome might not have changed dramatically. The Allies had overwhelming industrial and numerical superiority regardless of German tactical adaptations. But the war might have been longer and costlier for the Allies. Perhaps months of additional time for Germany to develop countermeasures. Perhaps significantly higher Allied aircrew casualties. Perhaps different strategic calculations by Allied leadership if bomber losses had remained prohibitively high even with fighter escort. But none of those possibilities were explored because Göring dismissed a warning and ordered his fighter commander to stop making such reports. This is how command failures manifest in war. Not through dramatic betrayals or obvious incompetence, but through the refusal to accept uncomfortable intelligence, through dismissing evidence that contradicts existing assumptions, through punishing subordinates who report problems instead of addressing the problems themselves, through giving orders that deny reality rather than adapting to changed circumstances. Adolf Galland tried to warn his superiors. He presented facts. He recommended solutions. He was ignored. And thousands of German pilots died as a result, fighting an enemy they had been told did not exist until it was far too late to prepare effective defenses. Final casualty statistics tell the story. Between August 1943 and May 1945, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 13,000 fighter pilots killed in action. Another 7,000 were wounded severely enough to be removed from combat duty permanently. The Luftwaffe began the war with approximately 3,000 trained fighter pilots. By war's end, it had trained over 30,000 replacements. Nearly 70% of them were killed or permanently disabled. The P-51 Mustang that Galland had warned about in December 1943 became the dominant fighter of a European air war. American P-51 units claimed approximately 5,000 German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat between December 1943 and May 1945. The aircraft fulfilled exactly the role Galland had predicted, escorting bombers deep into Germany, engaging and destroying Luftwaffe interceptors, achieving air superiority over the Reich itself. In his final interview before his death in 1996, Galland was asked if he blamed Göring for the Luftwaffe's destruction. His response was measured. Göring was a man of his time and his limitations. He had been a great fighter pilot in the First World War, but that was a different war, a different time. By 1943, he was no longer capable of understanding modern air warfare. He could not accept that the world had changed, that our enemies had developed capabilities we could not match. So he denied it. He ordered reality to be different, and reality does not obey orders. The railway platform at Rastenburg no longer exists. The station was destroyed during Soviet advances in 1945. But the moment that occurred there on August 17, 1943, defined everything that followed. A general tried to warn his commander about an existential threat. The commander gave an order denying that threat existed. And thousands died because orders cannot change reality. They can only ensure that reality arrives unprepared for.